The morning in Atlanta carried that strange quiet only found before sunrise. A stillness heavy enough to make a man believe the world was at peace. Dr. Elijah Carter, 42, a neurosurgeon at Atlanta Memorial, had just finished a 14-hour shift that left his body aching but his mind sharp. He drove home in his dark blue Mercedes, the city lights glinting off the hood like fading stars. His only thought was sleep, until flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. He pulled over immediately, hands on the steering wheel, not out of fear, but out of habit. In his world, being a black man meant preparation was survival. The officer approached, white, mid-30s, jaw tight, hand resting on his holster. "License and registration," he said curtly. Elijah kept his tone calm. "May I ask why I was stopped, officer?" "Broken taillight," came the reply, flat and automatic. Elijah almost smiled. His car had been serviced 2 days ago. "Understood," he said quietly. "My registration is in the glove compartment." "I'll reach for it slowly." The officer didn't answer. He just stared, scanning the car's interior with a flashlight beam that felt more like judgment than procedure. "Nice car," he muttered. "Pretty fancy for a guy like you." Elijah's fingers paused on the glove box. "I'm a neurosurgeon," he said evenly. "Work at Atlanta Memorial Hospital." The cop's smirk widened. "Sure you are. And I'm the president." When Elijah handed over his license, the man didn't even glance at it before leaning closer, eyes sharp, searching for defiance. "Step out of the car." His tone had changed. It wasn't an order born of caution, but of suspicion. Elijah complied, slow, deliberate. The asphalt was cold under his feet. Without a word, the officer patted him down, then turned to the open car door. Elijah watched as he bent slightly, one hand disappearing beneath the driver's seat. He knew that motion. Too fast, too practiced. Moments later, the man straightened, holding a small plastic bag filled with white powder. "Well, look what we found," he said. Elijah's jaw tightened. He didn't speak. Not a protest, not a word. Silence, he knew, could be louder than shouting. The officer smirked again, cuffing him roughly. "Guess that fancy hospital job's gonna have to wait." As the red-blue light strobed across the quiet neighborhood, a window creaked open across the street. Mrs. Hester Patterson, a retired schoolteacher, lifted her phone and began to record. Her hands trembled, but her voice whispered into the camera, "He didn't do anything. I saw it. He didn't." Elijah sat in the back of the squad car, wrists bound, eyes steady. Through the reflection in the window, he watched the officer adjust his uniform and talk into the radio, lying with the same ease as breathing. The irony burned deep. Years ago, Elijah had served as a combat medic with the Navy SEALs, saving lives under gunfire. Now he sat restrained, treated as a criminal in the country he'd once fought for. He looked up at the flashing lights slicing through the dawn and exhaled slowly. His voice was barely a whisper. "Different battlefield. Same war." The courtroom smelled of old wood, cold air, and arrogance. Dr. Elijah Carter sat quietly at the defense table, wrists still bruised from the handcuffs that had dug into his skin 2 nights earlier. Across from him, the arresting officer, Sergeant Miller, stood tall, uniform crisp, voice confident as he repeated the same false story he'd written in his report. The suspect appeared nervous during a routine stop. A search of his vehicle produced a small bag of cocaine under the driver's seat. Every word was rehearsed, clean, precise. Lies wrapped in the rhythm of authority. Elijah didn't flinch. He'd heard worse lies told louder. Beside him, his public defender, an overworked attorney named Marcus Green, whispered, "Don't react. Just let it play out." Elijah nodded slightly, eyes fixed on the judge, a stern man with silver hair and the detached tone of someone who'd seen too many cases to still care. When it was Elijah's turn to speak, he rose slowly, buttoning his jacket. His voice was low but clear. "Your Honor, I am a licensed neurosurgeon at Atlanta Memorial Hospital. I've never used drugs. I've passed every background check required for federal medical clearance." That evidence was planted. The courtroom murmured. The judge raised a hand. "Dr. Carter, do you have proof of this claim?" Elijah shook his head. Only the truth, Your Honor. The prosecutor, a young white man with too much confidence, smirked. The truth, doctor, is that drugs were found in your car. Are you suggesting that a decorated police officer risked his career to frame you? Elijah met his gaze without blinking. I'm suggesting that sometimes people see what they expect, not what's real. The prosecutor rolled his eyes. You're saying you were targeted because you're black? I'm saying I was targeted because I didn't look like I belonged in a Mercedes, Elijah replied, tone steady, almost gentle. A few muffled gasps echoed through the courtroom. Sergeant Miller crossed his arms, jaw clenched. The prosecutor leaned back with a smirk. No further questions, the judge sighed. We'll reconvene after lunch. Bail remains at $50,000. His gavel came down, final, uncaring. As the bailiff motioned for Elijah to stand, the unthinkable happened. Sergeant Miller, walking past, muttered something under his breath, a slur Elijah had heard too many times in too many places. Elijah didn't react, but the officer wasn't satisfied with silence. He turned suddenly, shoving Elijah's shoulder. The movement was small, almost casual, but in that moment the courtroom gasped. Elijah stumbled back a step. Then came the sound, the hard crack of Miller's boot connecting with Elijah's shin. The blow wasn't strong enough to injure a Navy SEAL, but the humiliation cut deeper than pain. The officer sneered, "Guess you're not so special now, huh, doctor?" For a second, everything froze. The judge's gavel mid-air, the clerk's mouth open, the echo of leather on bone hanging like a ghost in the air. Elijah looked up at the man, his eyes cold, unbroken. And then quietly, he said, "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Before the judge could speak, the bailiff's radio crackled sharply. Code 10, priority call for Judge Harrison. Line 1 from the Pentagon, immediate. The judge blinked. The Pentagon? Every head in the courtroom turned as the judge picked up the secure phone on his desk. His face shifted from irritation to disbelief, then to fear. He looked at Elijah, really looked at him for the first time. "Dr. Carter," he said slowly, "what exactly did you do before becoming a doctor?" Elijah stood tall, hands behind his back, like he'd done 1,000 times before. "I served, Your Honor. Navy SEAL Team 6. Retired Lieutenant Commander." The room fell utterly silent. The judge swallowed. On the other end of the line, a voice spoke loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Your Honor, this is General Avery Locke, United States Navy. The man standing before you is a decorated war hero with 6 commendations for valor. Whatever's happening in that courtroom ends now." Sergeant Miller's face drained of color. Elijah didn't move, didn't smirk, didn't even blink. He simply looked at the man who'd kicked him and whispered, calm as ever. "Different battlefield. Same war, but this time you're on record." The room had turned to stone. The sound of General Avery Locke's voice through the courtroom speaker still hung in the air like the aftermath of thunder. No one moved, no one breathed. Even the fluorescent lights seemed quieter. Judge Harrison, who moments earlier looked ready to dismiss Elijah as just another defendant, now sat frozen, his face pale beneath the weight of sudden realization. "Your Honor," the voice continued, calm but commanding, "Dr. Elijah Carter is not only a decorated Navy SEAL veteran, he's the man whose fieldwork and medical research saved dozens of soldiers during Operation Blue Phantom. He holds top-level clearance and was on my surgical team for classified missions. You're detaining a national asset." A heavy silence fell. The judge cleared his throat. "General, I assure you there must be some misunderstanding." "Sir," Locke interrupted, "the only misunderstanding here is why one of my officers had to call me from a courtroom where a war hero is standing in handcuffs." Judge Harrison stood immediately. "Bailiff, remove those restraints." The officer hesitated, eyes darting toward Sergeant Miller, who looked ready to sink into the floor. "Now," the judge barked. The cuffs came off with a metallic click that echoed across the room. Elijah flexed his wrists gently but said nothing. His silence was louder than any speech could have been. The general's tone softened, almost like an old friend speaking through the phone. "Lieutenant Commander Carter." "You all right, son?" Elijah exhaled slowly, eyes still locked on Miller. "I've been through worse, sir." That's what I figured, Locke said. We'll handle the rest. I'll have Jag contact the court in 15 minutes. You're free to go. The judge hung up the phone with trembling hands. For a long moment, he couldn't look at Elijah. When he finally did, the man's voice had lost all authority. Dr. Carter, the court deeply regrets. Elijah cut him off gently. Don't apologize to me, Your Honor. Apologize to every man who didn't have a general to call. A quiet murmur rippled through the room. The bailiff lowered his gaze. Even the prosecutor looked uneasy. Miller, pale and sweating, stepped forward, words tumbling. I didn't know who you were. Elijah turned to him slowly. That's the problem. You shouldn't need to. He adjusted his coat, picked up his briefcase, and walked out without another word. Cameras were already waiting outside the courthouse, flashes cutting through the midday sun. A few shouted questions. Dr. Carter, are you pressing charges? Were you really in the Navy? But Elijah didn't answer. He simply walked, calm, steady, like a soldier returning from a mission no one else understood. Inside the building, chaos erupted. The prosecutor was shouting about misconduct, the judge was on the phone with the district attorney, and Sergeant Miller was escorted into a side room for questioning. Within an hour, the video of the courtroom confrontation, the kick, the silence, the phone call, was online. By evening, it had gone viral. Headlines screamed across every network. War hero arrested and assaulted in court. Pentagon steps in. From battlefield to courtroom, the story of Dr. Elijah Carter. That night, Elijah sat alone in his apartment. The city lights flickered against the window. His phone buzzed constantly. Calls from reporters, from veterans, from strangers thanking him. But he answered none of them. Finally, one message came through, from an unknown number. A text. Locke. You've started something bigger than you realize. Carter. I didn't start anything, sir. They did. Locke. Then finish it with dignity. Like you always have. Elijah leaned back, exhaling slowly. For the first time since that night, he allowed himself to feel something. Not anger, not victory, but the old, familiar ache of responsibility. He looked at the scars on his wrists, faint but visible, then at the folded Navy flag on his shelf. Different battlefield, he murmured again. Same mission. And somewhere in the distance, beneath the noise of the city, the quiet hum of justice began to stir. By dawn, the story had already spread across every screen in America. News anchors spoke his name like a warning and a prayer. Dr. Elijah Carter, Navy SEAL veteran and neurosurgeon, wrongfully detained and assaulted in court. Every network replayed the same 20-second clip. The officer's kick, Elijah's silence, and the judge's stunned expression as the Pentagon called. The contrast between cruelty and composure was too powerful to ignore. Outside Atlanta Memorial Hospital, reporters swarmed the parking lot. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder with doctors, holding signs that read, "Honor, not humiliation," and "A hero deserves dignity." Elijah watched from his office window on the 12th floor, still dressed in his surgical scrubs. His assistant, Tanya, hovered in the doorway. "Sir, you've got requests from CNN, BBC, even Al Jazeera." "Everyone wants your statement." He shook his head. "Let them talk." "I'm not here to feed the noise." Tanya hesitated. "Then what are you going to do?" Elijah turned back to the window. "My job. Like I always do." While he scrubbed in for surgery, the Department of Justice launched a formal inquiry. Sergeant Miller had been suspended without pay, pending investigation. Civil rights organizations called for national hearings on racial bias in law enforcement. The mayor of Atlanta issued a public apology, but Elijah stayed silent. His quietness, the same restraint that had once been seen as submission, now felt like moral gravity. That evening, the Pentagon released an official statement. It was short and simple. Lieutenant Commander Elijah Carter served with distinction in the United States Navy. His conduct under pressure reflects the highest values of our service: courage, discipline, and honor. The press spun it as vindication. But to Elijah, it felt like a reminder that no medal or rank could protect a man from being seen as less than human. Later that night, General Avery Locke called again. The old man's voice was low and weary. "Elijah, they're planning to give you a national commendation. The president himself wants to meet you." "I'm not interested in ceremonies, General," Elijah replied. "I figured you'd say that. But this isn't just about you anymore. You've become the line." The moment people realized silence isn't the same as weakness, Elijah didn't answer. He walked out onto his apartment balcony, the city lights below flickering like a restless heartbeat. "If they really want to honor me, they'll fix the system that made this happen." Locke's tone softened. "Maybe that's exactly what's starting, son." The next morning, Elijah returned to the courthouse, not as a defendant, but as a free man. The crowd outside parted as he walked past, their applause quiet but heartfelt. Inside, the judge approached him privately, his face red with shame. "Dr. Carter," he said, voice trembling, "I've been on this bench for 30 years. I thought I'd seen everything. But yesterday reminded me that justice without humanity isn't justice at all." Elijah simply nodded. "Then maybe yesterday served a purpose, Your Honor." Across the hall, a young black boy no older than 12 held up a homemade sign. "My dad said you're a real hero." Elijah crouched down, meeting his eyes. "Tell your dad I'm just a man who didn't forget who he was." The boy smiled, and for the first time since the arrest, Elijah smiled too. That night, as he returned home, he turned on the television for the first time in days. A journalist was speaking over a photo of him standing in the courtroom, upright, calm, unbroken. "In a single moment," she said, "Dr. Elijah Carter reminded the world that true power doesn't shout. It stands still and makes everyone else listen." Elijah turned off the TV, leaned back, and whispered into the quiet, "Different battlefield, same fight, but maybe this time we're finally winning." 2 weeks later, the storm had only grown stronger. Across the nation, debates flared, not just about Elijah Carter, but about every man and woman who had ever stood in his place, unseen, unheard, unprotected. Talk shows filled with opinions. Politicians made speeches. Hashtags flooded social media. "Stand with Carter," "Honor not fear," "Justice in uniform." But Elijah avoided it all. While the world turned his story into a movement, he stayed where he belonged, in the operating room. At Atlanta Memorial, his team had gotten used to the quiet stares that followed him through the halls. Nurses whispered, patients smiled, and even the security guards greeted him differently now, not with suspicion, but respect. Yet Elijah carried himself no differently. His hands were still steady, his voice still calm, his days still long. When asked by a young intern how he managed to stay so composed, he said simply, "You don't heal anyone by being angry." Meanwhile, the investigation into Sergeant Miller reached its breaking point. The footage from Mrs. Patterson's phone, shaky but clear, had surfaced online. It showed exactly what happened that night. No drugs, no resistance, no justification. Just one man doing his job and another abusing his power. The video hit 20 million views in 3 days. Public outrage followed like a storm front. The police department called a press conference. Chief Daniels stood behind the podium, face tight, voice rehearsed. "Effective immediately, Sergeant Miller has been terminated from service. The department deeply regrets the misconduct that took place." Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Daniels added one last line, carefully worded. "Dr. Carter's restraint under injustice has reminded us all of what true discipline looks like." That evening, Elijah sat in his office watching the news feed in silence. General Locke called again. "You see what you've done, son?" "I didn't do anything," Elijah said. The general chuckled. "That's the beauty of it. You didn't need to. You just stood still and the truth did the rest." A few days later, a formal invitation arrived, embossed, official, carrying the seal of the White House. Elijah was to be honored at the National Medal of Freedom ceremony for extraordinary service to humanity and exemplary moral conduct. He hesitated to accept, but Tanya convinced him. "Sir, this isn't for you," she said softly. "It's for everyone who never got the call that saved you." When the day came, The East Room glowed with warm light and quiet anticipation. Dignitaries, veterans, doctors, and students filled the seats. The president stepped to the podium, holding the medal in his hands. Dr. Elijah Carter reminds us that strength isn't measured by force, he said. It's measured by character, the courage to stand still when the world demands that you bow. When Elijah approached the stage, the applause was thunderous, not the applause of fame, but of gratitude. As the medal rested against his chest, he looked out at the crowd, faces of every color, every background watching him not as a victim, but as proof that dignity still had power. After the ceremony, as he stepped outside into the soft evening air, a reporter called out, "Dr. Carter, what will you do next?" He smiled faintly. "Same thing I've always done," he said. "Help people stand up, even when they're told to sit down." That night, Elijah drove home in silence. He passed the same intersection where the flashing lights had stopped him weeks ago. The same stretch of asphalt, the same hum of tires, only this time the air felt lighter. In his rearview mirror, no red or blue lights followed, only the reflection of the city glowing steady and calm. He whispered the words that had carried him through war. Injustice and survival alike, different battlefield, same mission. And drove on, not as a man freed by luck, but as a man who had freed others simply by refusing to lose himself. Months passed, and the frenzy of headlines slowly faded. The world, always hungry for the next story, had moved on. But the echo of Elijah Carter's name still lingered in the spaces where it mattered most. Classrooms, police academies, and community halls where people began to ask why silence had to mean survival in the first place. At Atlanta Memorial Hospital, life returned to its rhythm. The sound of heart monitors, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, the murmurs of nurses, all familiar, grounding. Elijah moved through the corridors with his usual calm, though his steps carried a new weight now. To some, he was a hero, to others a reminder. But to himself, he was still just a doctor doing what he'd always done, saving people, sometimes from injury, sometimes from ignorance. One morning, a young medical student approached him outside the OR. She was nervous, clutching a stack of notes. "Dr. Carter," she said, "I just wanted to say, your story made me apply to medicine. I used to think people like us didn't belong here." Elijah smiled softly. "Then you'd better stay and make sure no one forgets you do." The girl nodded, eyes glistening, and hurried away. For Elijah, that small moment meant more than any medal. Meanwhile, the ripple of what happened in that courtroom had reached farther than anyone expected. Law enforcement departments across the country began adopting new Carter protocols, de-escalation and accountability standards named after him, not by government decree, but by officers who wanted to do better. Some even wrote to him personally, confessing that his calm had changed how they approached their work. Sergeant Miller, once the face of arrogance and abuse, now sat behind bars, convicted of falsifying evidence and assault. During his sentencing, the judge, the same one who had presided over Elijah's case, said quietly, "Justice is blind, but it must also learn to see." Elijah never attended the hearing. He didn't need to. Justice had already done its work. In Washington, General Avery Locke called one final time. "You've done more for this country with your silence than most of us did with weapons," he said. Elijah chuckled. "You give me too much credit, General." "No," Locke replied, voice steady. "I gave you the freedom to walk away? You gave the world a reason to look in the mirror." As spring came, Elijah took his first real vacation in years. He drove south to Savannah, where the ocean stretched endlessly into the horizon. Sitting on the pier, he watched the waves roll in, calm, relentless, unbroken. Beside him lay a worn Navy coin, the one given to him after his last deployment. He turned it over in his hand, tracing the engraved words, "Honor above all." He thought of the war zones, the hospitals, the courtroom, different places, same struggle. The fight had never really been against people, but against blindness, the kind that turns humanity into habit. As the sun dipped low, he stood, exhaled, and spoke softly to the sea. They tried to take my dignity. Instead, they gave me a voice. Later that night, he drove back toward Atlanta. The highway was quiet, the sky deep blue and endless. And as city lights shimmered on the horizon, Elijah smiled faintly, not because the battle was over, but because he'd learned how to fight it differently. "Different battlefield," he whispered, gripping the wheel. "Same mission." And for the first time in a long time, the road ahead felt wide open, like a sky no one could ever take from him again. It had been nearly a year since that morning on the highway. The flashing lights, the cuffs, the humiliation that turned into a movement. For most people, it had become just another story filed away in the archives of justice and reform. But for Dr. Elijah Carter, its shadow lived on, not as trauma, but as purpose. He returned to his life with the same discipline he had carried from the battlefield. Early mornings, precision, no wasted words. Yet everywhere he went, the world seemed to recognize him now. Airport staff greeted him respectfully. Strangers stopped him for handshakes, and young men, especially black men, looked at him the way soldiers look at their commanding officer. With quiet pride, with faith. One afternoon, Elijah stood at a podium inside a lecture hall at Emory University. Behind him, a large banner read, "The Carter Initiative, Ethics, Courage, and Leadership in Modern Medicine." The hall was packed, students, doctors, officers, even journalists. But Elijah didn't come to lecture. He came to tell the truth. "When I was cuffed on that highway," he began, "I thought the fight was about me, about my name, my career, my dignity. But I was wrong. The real fight was for everyone who won't have a general to call or a camera recording when injustice finds them." He paused, scanning the audience, letting silence carry the message. "The Navy taught me how to survive war. The courtroom taught me how to survive peace." The audience sat still. The only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint rustle of pens writing words they'd never forget. After the speech, a young police cadet approached him. Nervous, fidgeting with his badge, he said, "Sir, I watched your video the day I joined the academy. It made me want to be better, not just a cop, but a person." Elijah placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice calm but firm. "Then remember this, the badge doesn't make you right. The way you use it does." Later that evening, Elijah walked through the hospital one last time before heading home. In the pediatric wing, he passed a framed newspaper clipping. "Navy SEAL turned surgeon saves boy after rare brain trauma." Beneath it, someone had written in pen, "He saves lives everywhere." He smiled faintly and kept walking. Outside, the sunset painted the skyline gold, the same color as the medal that hung in a glass case on his office wall. A medal he never wore. It wasn't pride that kept it there. It was reminder. That night, the phone rang again, an unfamiliar number, Washington area code. When he answered, a calm, steady voice spoke. "Dr. Carter, this is Secretary Adams from the Department of Defense. We're establishing a new Federal Ethics Council for Veteran Reintegration and Public Safety. We'd like you to lead it." Elijah exhaled slowly. "I'm no politician." "Neither was Justice," Adams replied. "But it needed a man who understood both war and restraint. You're that man." The next morning, he stood before a small mirror, adjusting the same tie he had worn in court a year ago. For a moment, his reflection stared back, older, sharper, but lighter somehow. The weight of honor had replaced the weight of pain. Before leaving, he glanced at the medal on the shelf, then at a photograph beside it, his Navy team, grinning under a desert sky. On the back of the frame, one of his teammates had written, "We fight so others don't have to." He smiled and whispered, "Still fighting." Then he turned off the lights, stepped outside, and walked toward a new mission, one without weapons or orders, but no less vital. The city stirred awake around him, the dawn light spreading like a promise. "Different battlefield," he murmured again, sliding on his jacket. "Same mission." And somewhere, far above the city, a plane roared through the clouds, steady, free, and unafraid. Years later, the world had long stopped whispering his name on the news. The headlines had faded, the noise had moved elsewhere, and time, as it always did, had wrapped even the loudest revolutions in silence. But Dr. Elijah Carter never sought fame. He never needed the applause. His victory had never been in the courtroom or the medals. It was in what came after. He was now 70. His hair fully silver, his posture still straight, his eyes still steady. The same quiet strength that once made a courtroom freeze. The government council he once led had grown into a national program. The Carter Initiative, a network connecting veterans, police officers, and young students to rebuild trust through shared service. It wasn't perfect, but it was working. For the first time in decades, people were listening before reacting, seeing before judging. That morning, Elijah stood inside a small classroom at a community center in Savannah. The walls were lined with photographs, not of politicians or generals, but of ordinary citizens shaking hands, planting trees, teaching kids. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, raised his hand. "Sir, my mom says you were in the Navy and a doctor, and that you fought a bad cop and won." Elijah chuckled softly. "That's one way to tell it," he said. "But I didn't fight anyone. I just stood still long enough for the truth to catch up." The boy frowned thoughtfully. "So, you didn't get scared?" "Oh, I was scared," Elijah replied, smiling. "Bravery isn't not feeling fear. It's doing what's right while you're afraid." When the class ended, the children ran outside to play. Elijah stayed behind, looking at their laughter through the window, a sound freer than any anthem he'd ever heard. He walked slowly to a nearby pier overlooking the water. The ocean stretched endlessly, calm and bright. He took out an old Navy coin, the same one that had followed him from battlefield to courtroom to this quiet place. The words were worn, but still visible. "Honor above all." He closed his hand around it and whispered, still holding the line. Behind him, the sun began to set, painting the horizon in gold and crimson. The waves rolled steady in the same rhythm as his heart. For a long moment, he stood there, a solitary figure in the light, neither hero nor victim, just a man who had refused to surrender his dignity. A breeze lifted his coat, and he smiled faintly. "Different battlefield," he said under his breath. "Same mission." And as the wind carried his words across the water, they blended with the sound of the tide, endless, gentle and eternal. Somewhere far above, a single plane cut through the clouds, steady, sure, free.